ado then, I'm really excited for this first session, which is entitled Class Analysis versus Culturalism, From Identity Politics to Decolonial Theory, Afropessimism and Beyond. It's a kind of a great topic to kick off the workshop with because these issues are so fundamental to contemporary intellectual debates in the academy, but they have an enormous impact on the greater social world and on the political and organizing world. We have with us Derek Ford and Jennifer Ponce de León, who I'll introduce briefly in a moment. But just to give you a sense of the structure of the event is that we're going to have a conversation. They both have opening comments, and then I have some questions that I want to kind of engage them with. And we'll spend about what the French would call une petite heure. And une petite heure could be 45 minutes, 60 minutes, or an hour and 15. Having that conversation to begin to get things on the board. And then we'll open up to both the online program and the in-person program for une petite heure. So it will vary depending on where the conversation goes. We're going to try today to kind of toggle back and forth a little bit between the in-person and the online to kind of get different voices in. I think it's really important to make sure that everybody is as concise and precise as possible so that you're not the person in the room who asks a question that lasts 30 minutes, because we want to get in as many voices as we can, so don't hesitate, of course, as we're having our conversation to begin generating questions yourselves. For the online program, Constance is going to kind of oversee the questions, and you're more than welcome to begin formulating them and sharing them in the chat, and then she's going to kind of collate and potentially merge them, combine them, and figure out how best to formulate them when we open up a little bit later on. The reason that we're going to do it that way, at least for the start, is in the online program in the past, sometimes we've had certain technical glitches, and it's good to just have one point person who's kind of sharing the questions with us. We might experiment with doing that differently, but based on our experience, we're going to try that out for today. So the speakers for today are Jennifer Ponce de León, whom all of you, or a lot of you met at least briefly yesterday. She's an interdisciplinary scholar who researches 20th and 21st century left social movements and cultural production across the Americas, as well as post-colonial, anti-colonial, and Marxist thought. She's an associate professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's also faculty in Latin American and Latinx studies, comparative literature, and cinema studies, and I think also in gender and women's studies, no? She's the author, most notably of Another Aesthetics is Possible, Arts of Rebellion in the Fourth World War, which came out last year with Duke University Press. And we're joined today by Derek Ford, who's an associate professor of education studies at DePaul University. He teaches classes on how educational theory, history, and economics relate to political struggles. His writings have appeared in popular outlets such as Monthly Review, Black Agenda Report, and Hampton Institute. He also hosted and helped create the podcast series Reading Capital with Comrades, which I highly recommend. It takes listeners through volume 1 of Marx's magnum opus and is available on all major streaming platforms. And from what I understand, he's working on volume 2, or will soon be doing volume 2. He is the associate editor of Post-Digital Science and Education and deputy editor of the Journal of Critical Education Policy Studies. He also co-edits the book series Radical Politics in Education, chairs the education department at the Hampton Institute, and serves as the editor of Liberation School. So you can see Derek's a very, very busy boy. He also has a very impressive publication record. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll give a shout out to an edited compilation that Derek was in that just came out called The Future of Lenin. And if I'm not mistaken, your most recent book is the 2022 book, Encountering Education, Elements for a Marxist Pedagogy. He also published Communist Studies, Education for the Commons, that came out in 2022. In 2021, he published Marxism, Pedagogy, and the General Intellect, Beyond the Knowledge Economy, as well as another book called Inhuman Educations, Jean-François Lyotard, Pedagogy, Thought. So with no further ado, I think we'll turn the floor over first to Jennifer for her opening comments, then to Derek, and we'll get right into the conversation.
Thank you. So I'm going to open by talking about comparing and contrasting historical materialist approaches to thinking about ideology, culture, and specifically race, to culturalist approaches. And I'm going to start kind of with the bigger picture, but then also kind of include some commentary on contemporary schools of thought. I just wanted to say this, this research is, that I'm going to share with you is part of, in some ways part of a collaborative project that I'm working on with my colleague Anya Lumba at Penn. And it's also been very much informed by conversations I've had with previous speakers here at the Critical Theory Workshop, specifically Antonio Vázquez Arroyo, who gave a wonderful presentation last year, and John Harfouche, who did the year before, so I'd also really highly recommend their work. So basically, in the biggest picture, the historical materialist approach holds that human consciousness is eminently social and historical and emerges from the material activity of life processes. In other words, ideology is pragmatic and grounded in material practices. Therefore, historical materialism opposes analyses that cleave culture and ideology from their material base in social relations and practices. And it also poses the idea that historical causality can be attributed to ideas or worldviews alone. So this can be summarized as materialism's fundamental antagonism to idealism. And idealism here refers to a worldview that holds that the material world is shaped by forces that operate independently of it, such as metaphysical entities, spirits, or ideas or discourses that are detached from the material base in social relations. Idealism has historically been a refuge for superstitious thought and has historically been an ideological weapon of ruling classes. So indeed, I think as Althusser suggests, class struggle that takes place within theory can be understood at a very fundamental level as a struggle between idealism and materialism. So what does this mean for how we would think about race? One of the readings for this week, and I know these were optional, so I'm going to just provide brief summaries of these, but one of these readings by Adolph Reed Jr. really speaks to this issue, kind of laying out what a historical materialist approach to race entails. And Adolph, I should just mention, is a professor emeritus, political scientist from University of Pennsylvania, and really a leading Marxist scholar on questions of race and US political thought. So he summarizes this really neatly, I think, in saying that historical materialist perspective perceives capitalism as a social totality that includes modes of production, relations of production, and the pragmatically evolving ensemble of institutions and ideologies that lubricate and propel its reproduction, right? Okay. So this perspective stresses that racial ideologies cannot be separated from racist practices, and they have evolved as a constitutive element of social relations that are themselves anchored in the capitalist mode of production. Now, Reed defines race as an ideology that constructs populations as groups and sorts them into hierarchies of capacity, civic worth, and desert based on purportedly natural or essential characteristics attributed to them. So it's an ideology of ascriptive difference, like gender. And these ideologies help to stabilize social orders by legitimizing as the natural order of things hierarchies of wealth, power, and privilege, including the social and international divisions of labor. So therefore, we can think of, as Reed argues, the political economic function of racial ideologies, as he writes, lies in the social validity that is possible if social relations are objectified as intrinsic qualities of racial features, for example, or of gender, for example. So, because race is a historical and social product, and it is fundamentally pragmatic, we cannot simply say that racism happens here and now because it happened then and there. Right? So this is kind of thinking about what this methodology means for how do we actually account for histories of racism, their development, and the possibility of abolishing racism, right? And for the same reason, if we understand race as a historical product, a social product, then of course we understand why racial ideologies vary substantially over time and space. And that not only includes their kind of classificatory schemas and the narratives that are used to justify them, but also what's involved in being classified, the stakes of being classified as part of a race or another. And you can think about this as just a bit of historical perspective makes this really easy to see. If we think about, just for example, the US classification of many European immigrants, early in the 20th century as belonging to not white races that are not recognized today, or how colonial racial systems of classification in Latin America have changed dramatically over time, etc. So this historical materialist understanding of racism, again as a social and historical product, emphasizes not only its historical variance, but the possibility of its abolition, right? And as Barbara Fields writes, because race came into existence at a discernible historical moment for rationally understandable historical reasons, it is subject to change for similar reasons. Now, this view is fundamentally opposed to treating racial ideologies as transhistorical, as we see in many contemporary schools of thought, like, for example, Afropessimism. It is also opposed to treating racial ideologies as themselves a sufficient explanation for social practices, which is a move we also see in a great deal of academic theorizing about coloniality and race, which I'll get into. Now, like many other scholars, Barbara Fields argues that modern ideologies of race emerged along with the institution of slavery and the New World. Others, including Reid, have argued that race-like ideologies also functioned in pre-capitalist societies. I think some people take that argument in a kind of tangentious manner to say that, well, then race must be eternal or something like this. But that's not the case. It does not, just because it functioned in other forms of class societies that were pre-capitalist, doesn't mean that it's transhistorical, nor does it alter the necessity of analyzing how racial ideologies function within the social relations that are anchored within a particular mode of production, be that a pre-capitalist mode of production or a capitalist mode of production. So I want to contrast this to idealist and culturalist modes of pseudo-explanation. And particularly to modes of argumentation that exemplify a culturalist ideology. So as Samir Amin argues in his landmark book Eurocentrism, culturalism is a form of common sense that imputes invariable cultural features to certain peoples, suggesting that these features persist beyond transformations in economic, social, and political systems. And historical causality is then attributed to these cultural invariants. In other words, cultural arguments treat selected cultural and ideological traits in an ahistorical manner, ignoring the specificities of the historical processes that gave rise to those cultural traits, and then they imbue these traits with transhistorical permanence and universal explanatory power. Culturalism is ultimately a kind of tautological mode of reasoning, as the very thing that needs it to be explained, culture, is treated as the explanation. So this idealist and essentializing manner of characterizing groups of humans has long been a cornerstone of bourgeois and colonial ideology. It has functioned historically to legitimize the inequality and oppression created by capitalism and to obscure the history of this system and how it functions. While modernity is defined by the capitalist mode of production, the dominant ideologies it generates cannot be organized around a lucid recognition of the nature of this system without losing their function of legitimizing this system, right? So culturist arguments instead function to actually obscure the nature of this system, right? For example, a very common Eurocentric culturalist argument, it includes the claims that the emergence of industrial capitalism in Western Europe can be attributed to the unique cultural traits of Western Europeans, rather than the processes of primitive accumulation that European ruling classes undertook within Europe and through their colonial practices around the world, right? So again, these, if we think of the way that bourgeois ideologies systematically obscure the nature of capitalist reproduction and the origins of capitalism, culturalist ideologies are one form of these that function to this end. They're implicated in identitarian ideologies that propose that national, ethnic, or racial groups share essential traits and interests, thereby obscuring fundamental divisions and antagonisms within these groups. And I'm arguing that purportedly radical tendencies in academic theorizing, such as decolonial theory and Afropessimism, also recapitulate the forms and functions of bourgeois ideology via their culturalism and idealism. And when I'm talking about decolonial theory, I'm specifically talking about the kind of the group of academics who have kind of branded themselves as the school of thinking around modernity, coloniality, and decoloniality. For example, Walter Mignolo, and his work, The Expansion of Western Civilization Substitutes for an Analysis of Imperialism, for example. He represents geographic entities, such as Europe, as cultural unities, and makes recourse to kind of metaphysical explanations for such essentialism by claiming that different continents have the unique ontology. This kind of ahistorical and deterministic view of the social forging of humans' consciousness and culture really recalls colonial discourses. Another example of this is in the work of Nelson Maldonado Torres, who substitutes a critique of the imperialist class warfare of the European bourgeoisie with a culturalist condemnation of Europe in total. And these are, even though this kind of decolonial theorists really try to distance themselves from post-colonial theory, these kind of examples I'm giving you of these sort of culturalist arguments are really redeployments of arguments that have been previously made by some post-colonial thinkers, which themselves have been very thoroughly criticized. For example, Neil Lazarus critiqued academic post-colonial discourses for treating the West or Europe as an undifferentiated unity, which is then counterposed in a Manichaean manner to the non-West. So Lazarus warns that this kind of essentialist representations just reproduce the logics of Eurocentrism, the logics of Eurocentric, imperialist, and racist discourses, while simply inverting the values that had been accorded to the West and its others, right? He also notes that these type of arguments ignore the many ways that imperial processes transformed European societies, including their forms of thought. But he also says the most pernicious effect of these kind of culturalist accounts is their erasure of the specific agency of capitalist social relations in imperialist development, which deprives those who are invested in combating imperialism and its attendant ideologies of a necessary understanding of how it functions. Now, decolonial theory regularly deploys these type of arguments that Lazarus critiques by insisting that cultural and epistemological characteristics of the so-called West constitute the principal cause of historical developments and social conflicts. Decolonial thought shares with Afropessimism and structuralist and post-structuralist inflected post-colonial theory a kind of common idealist tendency to treat ideologies as supra-historical structures that organize social relations of domination and exploitation across time and in distinct socio-historical contexts. I also want to note that these discourses traffic in a foundational anti-Marxism, which makes perfect sense given the difference in the kind of their approach to these questions, right? And I think decolonial theory is really continuing the work of certain strains of anti-Marxist post-colonial theorists who preceded them and basically attempting to displace Marxism as a method and conceptual framework for analyzing imperialism, colonialism, and culture. Some of the familiar themes, I mean, if you read some of these works, these familiar themes will come up, that because Marxism is a product of the West, it cannot lend itself to struggles of decolonization. This kind of argument is, I would really say, is very racist insofar as it erases the robust history of Marxist practice and theory from outside the West, which is the history of Marxist revolutions in the 20th century, in many ways. The analysis, the kind of anti-Marxism also expresses itself in the argument that the analysis of class struggles, which means struggles over the means and resources that ensure life, is not actually of great importance to understanding colonialism, imperialism, and racism. Instead, they seek to replace class analysis with a culturalist analysis of epistemology. The decolonial theory also argues that political struggles oriented to taking state power are contaminated by a Western episteme and therefore cannot be properly decolonial. And instead, they argue that decolonization principally involves thinking differently, i.e. engaging in, quote, epistemic and subjective reconstitution, or, quote, thinking without modernity, as Nino puts it. I think these dismissals of Marxist thought are foundational to their project in two ways. One, because it allows them to represent themselves as an intellectual vanguard that has transcended historical materialist analyses, and whose directives also correct the errors of past anti-colonial struggles that were inspired or guided by socialist praxis. So this is a kind of predictable symptom of both the anti-Marxism of the US Academy as well as the kind of opportunistic branding that its institutional structures incentivize. And secondly, I think the dismissal of Marxism allows them to peddle as radical arguments that Marxists and others have long decried as reactionary, essentialist, racist, ahistorical, and ineffectual. So, and I want to say I do not disagree in any way with the basic argument that's embraced by decolonial theorists that racism and colonial processes persist in nominally post-colonial liberal democracies. But this insight is hardly the discovery of decolonial academics. We also shared an article by Portella called The Weapon of Theory Revisited that does a wonderful job of discussing theories of neocolonialism elaborated by Marxist leaders of anti-colonial liberation struggles like Thomas Sankara and Amilcar Cabral, who recognize the transitory, strategic, and limited function of formal decolonization. We can also look to the important work on internal colonialism developed in the 60s, such as in the foundational work of the Mexican anthropologist Pablo González Casanova and subsequent debates around this thesis. So these types of materialist analyses of internal colonialism, neocolonialism, are also very different from the flattening of different historical processes in a single trans-historical structure, such as we see in decolonial theorists' constant references to coloniality as an almost metaphysical model of power that supposedly organizes social relations from the 15th century to the present. Indeed, González Casanova, I think, very astutely argues for the importance of understanding how different historical processes, such as settler colonialism, imperialism, neocolonialism, and internal colonialism, are articulated with each other in particular social formations, right? Which then requires us to do that kind of actual work rather than just impute all of these different types of historical processes to some kind of trans-historical structure, much less to a kind of trans-historical epistemological structures. I'm going to go ahead and end there, and then we can continue.
Great, thanks so much. Derek, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Online? Okay. Maybe you can hear me too well. Okay, do people know generally what Afropessimism is? Okay. So, it's okay if you don't. I mean, that's maybe a good thing. No. So, basically, Afropessimism is associated primarily with somebody named Frank Wilderson, also one of his pupils, Jared Sexton, and in essence, the idea of Afropessimism is that the entire world, every social structure that exists is premised on, thank you, on the,
is that better?
Yeah, it's fine with me. Okay, is premised on basically the enjoyment of the suffering of black people and blackness, and that humanity, civil society, is irretrievably founded on the fungibility of blackness, and by which is meant black people, like actual people, right? And so this is...
Derek, I'm so sorry. Once we kill that and use this.
This became very popular in academia about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, around the time of a massive resurgence in the black liberation struggle in the United States, particularly in Ferguson, Missouri, in response to ongoing racist police violence. I don't know if anybody's from the United States or knows about, the police are just a racist murdering machine in the United States. It's a fact. And what was interesting and problematic was that all of a sudden the talk shifted from anti-racism and black liberation to anti-blackness and black suffering, and all of a sudden black people became black bodies. Right? And it prevented really a political struggle from taking place over what was going to be the direction of what's referred to as a Black Lives Matter movement, right? Because ultimately the question was about blackness and whiteness, and it wasn't a political question, right? Because blackness and whiteness are seen as ontological, like pure categories, right? Without divisions between them, right? And so the other interesting thing is, I was like looking around at all these white people, like myself, academics or activists, and I was like, why do you all love Afropessimism so much? You know, like, what is it about this theory that, like, is so attractive? I mean, one is it's, like, cutting edge, so it's, like, more radical than everybody else because, you know, everything is anti-black and, yeah, anti-black. But therefore you don't have to do anything, right? Ultimately, it's totally immobilizing, right? Because everything is, and Frank Wilderson says this in an interview with Jared Ball on mixwhatilike.com when he's asked about the Palestinian struggle. All right, he says, well, any struggle like that, it's anti-black from the jump. So, yeah, that's like a real quote. And a lot of this is premised, again, on, I mean, it's premised on terrible readings of Marx and Marxism, and also a total disavowal of the actual struggle of oppressed peoples and workers across the entire world, including in the United States. And so that's why it's very popular in academia, right? I mean, it does very well in academia because it doesn't challenge any of the actual structures that exist, right, other than critique them. And so, there's another related concept, which is that of racial capitalism, which was articulated in 1983, most famously in Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. The term isn't Cedric Robinson's. He got it from a 1979 journal that was titled Neo-Marxism and the Bogus Theory of Racial Capitalism. That was about the South African apartheid capitalist system. That Robinson basically took that terminology and applied it to a general theory of capitalism overall. Although it was really with the 2000 republication of that book, with Robin D.G. Kelly's foreword, that the term gained a lot of popularity. If you look up the term, if you were to, somebody should do a research on this. I wonder how many articles use the term racial capitalism in the title, or the abstract, or the keyword, and then actually define it in the article. Because I bet it's actually very few. There's very little actual definition of it. Because most actually reference Robin D.G. Kelly's foreword to the book. But in essence, Robinson's claim is that Marxism is like irretrievably white and Eurocentric, right? That its origins are in the West, and so therefore we need another tradition, right? And then interestingly, he goes to W.E.B. Du Bois, who, if you don't know, died as a member of the Communist Party. And every time he went to the Soviet Union, became more of a Marxist and more of a Leninist, right? So it has a lot, and then the other thing is that basically what I would like to do, I think, is take some time and talk about some of the sort of just very briefly, there's a couple of the basically very common critiques of Marxism that are just totally like bogus, right? But they get repeated so often that it's just like taken for granted, right? So it's like, oh yeah, obviously, right? And so one of these is that Marxism is a form of class reductionism, or that it privileges class and therefore loses sight of other power relations such as race. Now, in the manifesto of the Communist Party in 1848, Marx and Engels talk about, you know, the history of society as the history of class struggles. They didn't think of that, right? That's not Marx's invention, that was there before them. They said that capitalism has this advantage, that it increasingly polarizes society into two classes. Those are the proletarians and the bourgeoisie, the workers and the owners, right? The important thing, one, is that this is a political program, so it's like a very brief statement, right? Very brief sketch. It's obviously pedagogic, it's like didactic in that sense. But the other thing is that it's a process, right? It's not something that's completed. Right? It's not as if there's like, you know, you're a worker or you're a boss, right? I mean, there's landowners, right? And in Capital, actually, when Marx talks about workers and the proletarians, he literally means anyone who is subjected to the rule of capital. So it doesn't matter if you're waged or not, if you're employed or not. It doesn't matter where you work. It doesn't matter if you work for no wage. It doesn't matter if you're imprisoned, right? For Marx, you're part of the proletarian. You're part of the working class, right? But of course, the capitalist class itself is composed of various, you know, different groupings, right? The finance capitalists versus the merchant capitalists, right? I mean, the merchant capitalists, like, they hated Trump in the United States because of all the trade, you know, the trade war with China, right? The finance capitalists couldn't care less, right? So there's myriad differences, right, within these. And so that's the first thing, right? Class isn't economic. Right? It's not about like how much money you get. Right? It's about your relationship to the distribution and the production of the world. Right? What's my relationship to it? Do I have any say in it, or do I have no say in it? Right? That's basically what class is. Right? It's not about, you know, like $30,000 a year or something in this class. Right? And then the other, of course, is that Marxism is Eurocentric. And in the preface to the very first edition of Capital, Marx says that the aim of this book is to lay bare, right, the inner logics of capital. Right? And England serves as the chief illustration, because it's where capital was most highly developed. Developed is not a value term. Developed doesn't mean good, right? You can develop into a great serial killer, right? A highly developed serial killer. That's a highly developed capitalist system. That's what he's talking about, right? It's also where there was the most statistics available at the time, right? A lot of reports, right? A lot of data. And he says that even though England is so advanced, it still suffered from, quote, a whole series of inherited evils arising from the passive survival of antiquated modes of production, end quote, together with modern evils, right? So there's no such thing as like a pure capitalist system, right? There's a capitalist or a bourgeois society, a social formation, in which the capitalist mode of production is dominant, right? Not in which it's the only one. So for example, Marx talks about a slave mode of production, because to have slavery, you need to have a legal system, right, that makes slavery into a thing. There needs to be, you know, there needs to arise like a superstructure on top of it, right? So slavery and capitalism coexist. And in fact, in the last part of Volume 1, Marx, and the section on primitive accumulation, which, I don't know if you've ever heard about this, but apparently primitive accumulation is over. Marx said it was over, right? But Marx says very, very quickly, right, because he's trying to, you know, debunk the idea that, you know, the reason why they're rich people is because once upon a time they were smart and they saved their money and they worked hard, and then, you know, I'm poor because I'm stupid and I'm lazy and I'm wasteful or whatever, right? And Marx says, actually, no, right? That capital was so developed in England precisely because it was the center of the world colonial project. Right? So he attributes it to, among other things, conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, national and international debts, the enclosure of common lands, the violent disciplining of peasants and wage laborers, the discovery of gold and silver, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, and, quote, slavery pure and simple, end quote, in the United States. That's why England was an advanced capitalist economy, right? And this is actually way before Capital. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx said that without slavery you have no cotton, without slavery you have no modern industry. Cause slavery to disappear and you will have wiped America off the map of nations. Right? Clearly somebody who didn't take race into account. But here's the other thing, is if you actually, so the most general interpretation, you see this all the time, is that the story of primitive accumulation is like a historical thing that's over and done with, right? So David Harvey, for example, who is a Marxist, says, no, that's not true, and he has this whole thing about whatever, about how it's still going on today. But if you actually read the text, at the end of the very introduction to this part, Marx explicitly acknowledges that, quote, in different countries, this assumes different aspects and runs through its various phases in different orders of succession and at different periods, right? And Marx provides a million origin stories of capitalism throughout the book, right? Because there's not like a single origin. It's not as if there was this thing called feudalism and the contradictions became so clear that it just progressed into this other thing called capitalism, right? And that's actually what Cedric Robinson says that Marx wrote about, right? But, you know, in reality, actually, capitalism was more developed at an earlier stage in China than it was in England, right? And that's why what's called the Century of Humiliation happened, right? Where England, the British, you know, recolonized China. I mean, and, you know, that's what the Opium Wars were about, right? They had to eliminate capitalism in China so that England could be the dominant capitalist power, right? The dominant colonial power. And Marx knew that, which is why he actually supported the struggles of Chinese peasants and in 1857 said that the Taiping Rebellion in China would be the spark, could be the spark that would actually inspire the British workers in Britain, right? So in other words, Marx said the spark of the workers' movement would be in China for people who weren't even industrial workers. So, so that's just not true. Like, that's just a ridiculous thing to say, right? Like, you just have to read the book and, like, read the introduction, you know, and keep that in mind. I mean, which isn't, like, you know, it's a hard book, and, you know, there's a lot to keep in mind, but, you know, you have to be really clear, like, careful about these things, right? I mean, Marx will say all the time, like, here's an absolute law, and then he'll be like, obviously, it's modified and it's working by a million different circumstances, right? That's what laws are. They're not like, you know, it's not like an iron law or something like that. The other thing, and this is where I think it intersects nicely with what Jennifer was talking about, is this idea that Marxism has a problematic understanding of the human, right? And this is where Afropessimism gets a lot here. So, and here I want to talk about Marx's, this text called the introduction to the Grundrisse Notebooks. So it was written in 1857. The Grundrisse Notebooks were a series of really the first time Marx started to write systematically in his sort of mature age about political economy, a critique of political economy. And he started doing it in 1857 because there was an economic crisis in the United States, and it was the first time that a crisis in the United States really had international effects, and Britain was hit the hardest, and so he set to work. He wrote to Engels, he said, I'm working like a madman, right? But before he could study and critique political economy, he had to figure out how he was going to critique political economy, right? And so that's what it's called the 1857 introduction to the Grundrisse Notebooks is. And he starts and he says, okay, well, where did the political economists start, right? Where do Smith and Ricardo and, you know, where do they all start? Well, they start with individuals producing in society, right? You know, I go to work as an individual, I get a wage, let's start there. And Marx says that we're going to start with socially determined individual production, right? It's not the same as the individual or the like isolated, independent, autonomous, you know, hunter or fisherman or something, right? And Marx's argument is actually that the very idea of the individual subject is historically produced through capitalism in large part, right? That only under capitalism can we have the appearance of independence where it appears as if, you know, I choose where I go to school and I can sort of choose what trade I get into and where I work and what I buy at the store, you know, that's separate from you, as if, you know, you all have nothing to do with any of that, right? But obviously you do, because who makes the stuff that I buy at the store, you know, right? I mean, so we're in this highly developed, actually interconnected social system, right? But we appear as individuals. And it's actually only in a very highly developed social system in which there's so much social interconnection and interdependency in which we can appear as individuals. And so Marx's problem with the political economists is not that they start with the individual, it's that they end there, right? They don't ask, how did it come to be? What was there before, right? What does this hide? What does it reveal? Right? And so, because it's, how does it that we appear to be detached from social bonds, right? And this is where some of Marx's historical argument comes in, where it's like, you know, if you're working, if you're a serf, you know, working on the land, it's very clear, there's a very clear social bond, right? In slavery, there's a very clear social bond, right? It's a barbaric bond, but it's very clear, right? It's not like that under capitalism, right? That's one of the main distinctions between capitalism and other modes of production, is that we're like sort of free individuals who enter into contracts, right, quote unquote, willingly. And so what Marx says is that, you know, they take the individual not as a point of departure, like, you know, but as something that's basically eternal. They project it as an ideal back into the past, right, some timeless thing. In the same way that Afropessimism does about blackness and white supremacy in particular, right, and U.S. white supremacy in particular, right. And just to talk a little bit more, because I mean, I was just reading this book, which is kind of one of the reasons I'm talking about it. But in the Grundrisse, right, Marx talks about how labor is social under capitalism, right, because it produces things for other people, right, so it's necessarily social, right. But the social character of production only takes place when we exchange, you know, our money for other commodities, right? That's when we realize that, oh, we're part of society, right? Not beforehand, right? Which is one of the differences between communal production and capitalist production. He says, you know, production by an isolated individual outside society is as much as an absurdity as like the invention of language without people talking to each other. So his main point here, right, is that the bourgeois economists take the present forms of appearance in society, right, and project them into the past, right, which has the effect of making capitalist social relations natural and eternal, rather than historical and transitory, right, and this holds more generally for all categories of political economy: distribution, consumption, exchange, right. And when Marx turns to historical materialist methodology, he talks about the population, right? I mean, Adam Smith's book, right, is The Wealth of Nations, right? He's talking about the nations. Nations have a population. We're called the people, right? So political economists begin with the population, right? That's who works. That's who produces and consumes and exchanges. And Marx says, you know, yeah, okay, so we'll start, it's a productive force in any nation, it's the foundation and the subject of the entire social act of production. But on closer examination, this proves false. The population is an abstraction if I leave out, for example, the classes of which it is composed. These classes, in turn, are empty phrases if I'm not familiar with the elements on which they rest, right? Wage, labor, and capital. This is why the population is a chaotic conception of the whole, right? So the trick for Marx and historical materialism is you take the whole, I mean, where else do you start but where you are, right? But then you have to break it down into ever more precise and accurate determinations or abstractions that are particular to a given space and place, right? Because there's differences, right, over time and across space. And then what you do with those abstractions is you then return to the whole, right, with these abstractions in mind, and you have a clearer understanding of reality. And so therefore, you know, you intervene in that reality, and then you change it, right, and then you go back and do the abstraction, you know, you repeat the process again, right? I mean, the example that I give often is like music, when you listen to music, right? When you listen to music for like a song for the first time, you can't hear every single thing, right? You have to like concentrate on certain elements of it at one point. You know, you can't listen to like the bass line and the drums and the vocals. You can't give them the same attention, right away. You have to sort of parcel them out, abstract them, right, and then listen to it again after having done all these abstractions. And so, obviously, right, he's talking about production and labor, right, because these are categories that are specific to, well, that are general, right? People always produce, right? But that kind of doesn't tell us anything. Right? We talk about people always, you know, production in general, right? That doesn't tell us anything, right? Why? How? Under what relations are they produced, right? And this is really, I think, what historical materialism explains about, helps in the anti-racist struggle, the struggle for black liberation against white supremacy, is it helps us understand, like, what are the actual current forms of anti-black racism, other kinds of racism, and white supremacy, right? What are they for? And where are their trigger points? Where are their weak points? Where can they be hit the hardest, right? So, if slavery and Jim Crow, people know Jim Crow segregates like a, you know, like an apartheid system in the United States after the Civil War. So slavery and Jim Crow, right? They produced black people as particular kinds of subjects, but they did so differently because of the changing relationship to the capitalist mode of production, right? So Eugene Perrier has a book called Shackled and Chained, which critiques another book about mass incarceration that's called The New Jim Crow. The New Jim Crow is very, very popular in the United States, and basically, right, it's like, okay, yeah, there's parallels between Jim Crow, it's like a, you know, it's like a white supremacist racist system, and mass incarceration, which is also a white supremacist racist system. But the difference turns precisely on the relationship to that social totality that Jennifer was talking about, right? So he writes, quote, "White supremacy and racism are not floating in the air as independent and anonymous forces with the power to restructure society. They operate in tandem with and ultimately are subservient to the evolving capitalist economic structure. Thus, slavery was not just racial oppression, but a system based around a particular form of labor super-exploitation. Jim Crow, too, was designed and continuously redesigned to secure and suppress black labor in the region's planter-dominated agriculture and low-wage industries, end quote. Mass incarceration is different from both of these, right? Because one, it's a political and it's a state response to the black liberation struggles of the 1960s and the 1970s, right? Two, it's about controlling an unemployed segment of society, right? Whereas Jim Crow is actually about policing the labor of black people. Mass incarceration is about removing black people from their neighborhoods and their communities, right? And Jim Crow impacted black people regardless of class. Mass incarceration does not do that. There are a lot of distinctions, right? And finally, while Jim Crow was organized to suppress the sort of enfranchisement, right, of black people writ large, their participation in civil society and voting, right? Mass incarceration doesn't require the wholesale elimination of black political participation. And in fact, mass incarceration in the United States arose, right? That was the repressive response to the black liberation struggles, but the other response was the incorporation of black people into positions of power, what's called black faces in high places, right? So Afropessimism, it takes the category of blackness or whiteness like the population, is like is a chaotic conception, right? That you can't, but without breaking it down into the different determinants that make something concrete in a particular moment in time, right? So for example, slavery in the US is very different from slavery in Libya, right? This is my final point. After the US overthrew the Libyan government in 2011, which was really a social democratic government, the government of Muammar Gaddafi, slavery was brought back into Libya. So there's like slave markets today in Libya. And Muammar Gaddafi and the government they were Pan-Africanist, right? So there was a lot of, they gave a lot of money to African liberation struggles. They built, whenever the United States would try to get a country to host AFRICOM, right? They'd say, oh, we'll give you $3 million, we'll put AFRICOM here. Muammar Gaddafi would say, we'll give you $6 million to keep it out, right? So a lot of people came from all over Africa to defend the government, right? And a lot of them are from sub-Saharan Africa, right? They were darker skinned. And so the US basically was like, oh, look it, he's paying these, darker skinned Africans who don't have any job prospects or whatever to defend him, right? That's a very different scenario than slavery in the United States, and Afropessimism can't explain that because ultimately it doesn't let us identify and understand our main enemies, which is imperialism and white supremacist capitalism, right? Those are the enemies. Thank you. Sorry. That was
no worries. Great, well thanks for, kill that mic. I just have maybe two questions to get the conversation rolling, and I know that we're already kind of deep into our time, so I'll formulate them kind of for both of you. The first one though, I think is more specifically related to Jennifer's work, and that is, what's the relationship between culturalism and racism? How do their histories intersect or not? Are they the same thing? And one of the motivations for that question is that there is a quite extensive debate in areas or in scholarship on the history of racism that tends to say, here I'm thinking of Etienne Balibar or Emmanuel Wallerstein and some others who say that, well, racism used to take this earlier form, which was biological racism or so-called scientific racism, but as of late it has shifted to a cultural form of racism, being displaced from the identification of skin color to that of cultural practices. So I'd love to hear you on that, and Derek, if you have anything you want to chime in on. The second question really, it relates to what Derek was saying, and it relates really to I think what is one of the core issues in what both of you are presenting. And that is that the discourses that you're being critical of that themselves accuse Marxism of being reductionist are perhaps the most reductionist discourses that we've ever seen in a few senses. One is the geographic reductionism. And in particular, Jennifer, I'd like to hear you more on that, because there's an idea that if somebody thought something in Europe, then it's tainted by and bears the kind of scarlet letter of E and therefore should just be destroyed for all time. What's the relationship between where ideas or practices emerge on the one hand and how they circulate? You mentioned Antonio Vázquez Arroyo, who last year came to the Critical Theory Workshop and has a great account of why we can't restrict ideas to their geographic point of emergence, because then we have no account of the historicity of thought, the materiality of thought, etc. So I'd love to hear you more on that. And that's combined with, in listening to both of you, an enormous historical reductionism. where instead of having global class struggle in which there are different sites of confrontation between economic modes of production, as Derek was saying with China, for instance, what you have is modernity. And modernity becomes this grab-all category that then tends to function at an epistemic level, right? So it's not just that there's a grab-bag category of modernity that sums up the entirety of what's happened over the last 400, 500 years, depending on what the chronology is, but then the way of doing that is erasing class struggle and materialist modes of analysis in the name of identifying something like the European episteme or modern modes of thinking or coloniality of power. There's lots of different ways of doing this, but they're all idealist, or at least traffic in idealism. And so I'd love to hear both of you on this kind of geographic, historical, and ultimately idealist reductionism that's operative in these traditions that you're being critical of.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Those are great. So the first, I think, Samirman, again, as I was talking about his writing on culturalism, he argues that culturalism is inextricable from ideologies and practices of racism. And I think the kind of affinity between culturalism, as I was talking about, as a kind of essentializing ways of thinking about peoples by talking about their culture as kind of having these essential traits, the affinity between that and racism really comes into sharper focus when we look at the history of ideas about difference among human species. Ideas about religion and culture, for example, were central to the historical development of the idea of race. This is something Anya Lumba, who I mentioned, has written about extensively in her studies of racism across pre-modern and modern periods. So, and she argues, that the categories deployed by the biological discourse of race were in fact always cultural, which makes sense since there isn't, these are invented, like pseudoscientific kind of discourses. So, racialization has not rested only on the myth of biological difference. Notions of civilizational difference and cultural difference have always been key to racialization. You can think, the kind of colonial discourse of civilization versus barbarism, or in Victorian ideology, class, like race, was associated with innate qualities, attitudes, values, and behaviors, which were understood as the cause of individuals' social position, right? So that's another example here. We have the kind of same logics that we think of modern racism, but they're deployed around class, and indeed, as Domenico Losordo has argued, the kind of colonial racism that was fomented among the English was a displacement of earlier racializing discourses that took the industrial proletariat as their object, right? So I think this idea that neo-racism as a kind of cultural form of racism, that's new is totally incorrect. And I just also wanted to mention another, I think, really good example of the kind of porosity between what we think of culturalist discourses and racism. A really great example of that is like contemporary underclass ideology, which has, and this is something that Adolph has written about a lot, which is a kind of naturalization of culture as a kind of independent force that is the reason why people are poor, basically. So I think that to your first question, for the question of geographic reductionism, if that's okay.
Yeah.
One other example I wanted to mention about culturalism and racism. I think the kind of clash of civilizations discourse and the culturalist discourses that are used in kind of contemporary Islamophobia are really great examples, again, of kind of culturalist forms of racism. In terms of the geographic determinism, I really love, as you mentioned, Antonio Vasquez Arroyo's work on the problem of how this kind of geographic determinism really obscures the historicity of thought. Because we can trace how, thought takes on different determinations as different people use it and change it over time, but we really can't do that with this very crude kind of dichotomization of the West and the rest, right? Which, as I mentioned before, among other things, completely ignores the kind of dialectical relationships involved in imperialism, the way that the West was changed by, all of the Western thought has been changed through contact and conquest with other peoples, etc. But I think there's also, I also want to say that this kind of way that this idea of geographic determinism is deployed, particularly in decolonial theory, I really think is an alibi more for a kind of summary dismissal of forms of thought that they are opposed to. Because it is ridden with so many logical fallacies. Beyond, I mean, even in addition to the fact that, you know, to say that like thought comes from somewhere, therefore it's always branded as that, like saying, I don't know, algebra is going to forever be Persian or something, even though people all over the world use it. That's kind of what, you know, how illogical that is. But then there's also these unbelievable acrobatics that they go through to try to classify certain thinkers as decolonial and other thinkers as Western, or certain events as Western and others as not. For example, Nino argues that the Chinese Revolution is Western and infected by I mean, this is crazy, thinking of one of them, you know, this anti-colonial revolution of unbelievable world historical significance would be infected by a Western episteme, for example. But this, I really think, has to do more with the kind of antipathy towards Marxism and socialism that runs through their thought. Or even on the positive side, you have, you know, you can have Maldonado Torres, who argues that basically the Western left is irredeemably racist, that Marxism is irredeemably Eurocentric, but considers Levinas, who's been criticized for Zionism, as, you know, a decolonial thinker. So there's this kind of, you know, cherry picking of who is going to be, you know, appropriately decolonial and who isn't. And I think there's, and I also want to say in terms of, the flattening also, as you mentioned, the kind of flattening of modernity becomes, then modernity becomes this grab bag category that includes, that flattens out also the critique of modernity that has been developed in the West, right? Which is, I mean, that is what Marxism, for example, is offering. But in the idea that you just have modernity, or as the decolonialists put it, modernity / you know, hyphen coloniality, that the kind of difference between discourses that legitimate and champion capitalist modernity and those that critique it is totally erased. And that's, you know, also Mignola does this in his argument that basically Marxism and liberalism are, you know, and Marxism is fundamentally a critique of liberalism, but he says these are basically both just kind of Western discourses and that are opposed to decoloniality. And I think this is kind of basically a decolonial spin on the old kind of anti-communist totalitarian discourse that tries to collapse, you know, that would argue that like fascism and communism are the same kind of thing, right? And finally, I just wanted to note the other thing I think that goes on with this type of geographic determinism is the corollary to the idea that, you know, all thought that comes from the West is useless for liberation struggles. The corollary to that is the idea that tools for liberation must come from the third world or from quote-unquote indigenous thought. But what often happens in a lot of this work is there's no specification of what indigenous thought or what thought from the third world or what precisely political strategy that would come from there would be kind of useful for decolonial struggles. And in fact, you know, people who have critiqued, others who have critiqued decolonial thought have noted, well, one of the reasons there isn't that kind of elaboration is because a lot of these thinkers don't even do empirical research or work in indigenous languages. And I think that, I really think that that figure, the kind of, what it actually is happening is you have more of a kind of figure of the decolonial thought from elsewhere is more of a kind of fetish of an absolute alterity. The kind of hope that there would be some kind of extra ideological subject, and that is from where liberation must come from. Exactly how that's going to happen isn't explained. But in this way, in many ways, I think it's a kind of warmed over, in many ways, neo-indigenous spin on postmodernist discourses that are kind of always situating the hope for some kind of unexplained liberation and some kind of absolute alterity that would be extra ideological, right? And there's also a way that, and this is something that these authors, Gossans and Marcardin, argue that this type of lack of elucidation of what this, you know, liberatory thought might actually consist in, even though it's constantly gestured to, they argue that this is a kind of messianic type of politics where then the theorist positions themselves almost as the kind of high priest who is then going to be the interpreter of this kind of absolutely other type of thought that we don't exactly know what it means, but they can be the ones to identify it for us.
It's really interesting. I'll just note quickly that a lot of the figures that you're touching on are also figures who engage in a kind of performative contradiction in their critique of Eurocentrism, because they're almost all very well versed in postmodern modalities of thought that then they redeploy with the spin of third world credibility to a certain extent, even though many of them are very elite, and that's one of the reasons they want to erase global class struggle, so that you don't see that, well, there's class struggle in the third world. And so if it be Maldonado Torres and Dussel, who are Levinasian and very dedicated to Levinas, if it be Spivak, who's Derridian through and through, like, there are so many examples of the ways in which they are, which I think also speaks to a larger issue of the kind of neoliberal configuration of a knowledge economy that wants to preserve these kind of postmodern modalities of thought, but give them, as Derek was saying, it's either black faces in high places, or in this case we have the diversity industry that then redeploys these exact same thought structures, right? Because the thought structures are more or less identical. It's the fetishization of difference, it's the critique of totalizing thought, which is a stand-in for their anti-communism, and all of that, I think, is of a part. So I just wanted to add that on.
Oh yeah, I just want to add just one quick thing to that, and then which is, I think, because you have this account of knowledge, this very crude kind of what they call a kind of geopolitics of knowledge, but that ends up kind of, as I said, you know, carving the world up into the West and its rest. You don't have account of the political economy of knowledge. And this is something that the Bolivian sociologist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui has argued in her critiques of decolonial theory, is saying, you know, well, if you actually would consider the political economy of knowledge and how it relates to this theory, well, this is a kind of neocolonial or an imperialist relationship that this type of theory produced in elite institutions in the US and then exported to Latin America. She says this is a kind of more of an example of a kind of elite form of theorizing that then, you know, has all these pernicious effects, but that also is, you know, and she also argues, critiques it for the kind of fetishization of alterity that she says works perfectly with the kind of forms of neoliberal multiculturalism that don't want to actually change the social positions of, you know, for example, indigenous people, but would prefer instead a kind of theatrical displays of otherness.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and also, like, where are you publishing all this stuff where you talk about how, you know, we need to decolonize everything? Yes. So, I mean, like some of my interest in this came from a practical problems facing, like, teaching and in political struggles. Like, you know, talk about reductionism. Well, like, listen to black people, follow black people, right? Well, it's like, well, what black people? You know, because, like, they're not all the same. They don't all have the same politics, right? Like, that's a fundamental thing that this prevents us from addressing, right? I mean, talk about a reductionism. And, you know, it's also, like, historically and geographically reductionist, like, in its Eurocentrism, which is that it totally denies and glosses over, or, like, you know, caricatures, like, where, like, liberation struggles have taken place, where socialist revolutions have taken place, which is, like, not in what countries of white people generally, right? But in, like, you know, Guinea-Bissau, Burkina Faso, Korea, Vietnam, China, right? Ethiopia, like, you know, like, what about those thinkers? They never talk about Thomas Sankara. They never talk about Kim Il-sung. They never talk about Mao Zedong, right? But I will say one thing is that it helps me kind of understand, like, where do they come, like, why are they thinking this way? You know what I mean? Like, not only, like, obviously, like, it's popular or whatever like that, but, you know, obviously, like, they're coming about the thinkers in a period of, like, counter-revolution, you know, like, between 1945 and 1981, there were, like, it looked very good for revolutionary struggle, you know, like, 2/5 of the world was living under, you know, governments that were socialist or, you know, had just liberated themselves from colonialism, right? And then, you know, the US goes on a full court press, splits China and the Soviet Union, full court press against the Soviet Union, you know, complete just, like, you know, support of, you know, counter-revolution. So it's a very, like, dismal time. Right? And so that's kind of when people are like, oh, and obviously, like, you know, I mean, somehow they thought that, like, anti-colonial governments would just be perfect or something like that, and there wouldn't be contradictions within them, but, you know, there's also a sort of disillusionment with that in addition to their material basis and their class basis, right? But here's the thing, here's the real question. Frank Chapman just had a book come out like Marxist-Leninist perspectives on black liberation in the United States. Anyways, basically his question is this, like, okay, does it really matter where a theory comes from, or does it matter, does that theory help us get free? You know, has it helped us liberate ourselves? Does it, like, will it? That's the real question. Not where does it come from, but like who came up with it? You know, it's like, not like whoever invented like airplanes, it's like, oh, you can't fly because you're not from there, you know? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? And I will say that historically, one of the continuities in racialization and pretty much all forms of actually oppression along the lines of identity has to do with really disability, by which is meant your ability to like productively participate in the country or in a given social formation, right? Because how, on what grounds do you exclude people from participation, right? They're stupid, incompetent, right? Unable to do it, they can't read, they can't write, they're unreasonable, irrational, right? All these things. So basically one's proximity to disability is often like a legitimating grounds for one's oppression based on identity, right? But disability itself is an ideological category because none of us are able to, one, and two, right, that's historically determined. Like, you know, before industrial capitalism and the printing press, nobody gave a shit if you could read or not, right? Like they wouldn't, like now we segregate students based on their reading ability, right? But we did not do that back then. Why? Well, there's a material explanation for that.
Great points. I know we're getting ahead in time, so why don't we go ahead and open up. I have some other questions that I might end up bringing in at some point, but Pedro, you want to get us started out? And Constanza, maybe you can figure out which question to start with for the online program in a sec. So go ahead.
So I guess this is kind of for both of you. Marxism is kind of a gap in my knowledge, so I just wanted, I guess, a bit of a clarification on the relationship between culturalism or whatever.
Oh, can you turn your mic on?
Sure. Is it on? Okay. So I guess I wanted a clarification on the relationship between material, or I guess historical material approaches, and I guess call it psychological or cultural approaches. And my entry to this question is when it was brought up that Marx said that capitalism produces the illusion of individual subjects. It made me think of two other thinkers who have kind of different explanations. Nietzsche says, or said in the Genealogy of Morals, that the individual subject is created as a means to direct guilt towards the individual. And Hans Jonas, in his work on Gnosticism, kind of gives a historical, call it phenomenological or psychological evolution of how, beginning with pantheism, where it seems like the world is invested with life, and then with Gnosticism, you get the removal of God from the world, and just only the subject remains with a divine nature, and then also creates this kind of illusion of a subjectivity. And so that's kind of the approaches that I'm used to, and I've found them very useful for understanding, for example, what sort of subjective, I don't like that word because it assumes a separation of both, but I found it useful in understanding what sort of relations, subjective relations that exist among people that allow for us to take nature as a commodity in the first place. And that's not a universal thing, right? It doesn't seem like you can ascribe a kind of teleological character to that it's kind of inevitable that capitalism would occur. It's clearly not the case, because there are other approaches and ways of living that are being wiped out. And so I guess my question is there a place for that kind of approach where we attempt to understand, I mean, how is it even possible for capitalism to arise in the first place? What sort of psychological or subjective relation had to exist for us to take nature as a commodity in the first place? Because to us, it seems like that's just how it is, right? We look at nature, we see something as a material at our disposal, but that's clearly not obvious or a human fact. So just wondering, can this form of analysis complement Marxist material historical analysis, or is there no place for that kind of thinking?
Yeah, sure. I will say I'm not super familiar with like the scholarship you're talking about, but yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, you know, my interest, I mean, I'm a communist, right, or a Marxist, but, you know, not because like Marx you know, we have to go back there, you know what I mean? But just because, like, the reason why, like, this takes the form of a defense of Marxism is because, like, there's so much slander against it, and it's political, you know, it's not like I have some affinity for whoever, you know, Marx or something like that, you know, like, I'm personally interested in him. But, like, the theory has provided oppressed peoples, you know, with, like, a weapon, you know, to free ourselves and to get more free, you know? So I think absolutely it should be supplemented, right? We have the principle of the united front, right? Which is that we have maybe irreconcilable differences, very substantial political differences between us, but when we have a common enemy or a common cause, we set those aside to defeat our enemy, you know? And during the Chinese Revolution, you know, there was one point in time when the Chinese Communist Party, they put on the uniforms of the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek's army, right? They were previously killing each other, literally fighting each other. And then, right, to fight the Japanese, they make a deal, and they literally put on the uniforms of their enemies, right, for a period of time to fight together. And then they go back, right, afterwards. So no, absolutely, I think that we should take whatever we can, right? But the thing about, you know, psychology itself, or like thinking about the mind itself as something that's separate from the body, or, you know, something like that itself is a historical product too, right? As, I mean, you know, the mind-body split or whatever, right? So, so yeah, I think like what I would be interested in is like, yeah, when does that come about? Why? What function does it serve? But this is an educational process, right? I mean, we're all pedagogic, like we're all inaugurated into thinking about this, right? Into thinking about things, and just seeing things, knowledge, etc., as commodities. You know?
If I may, just to complement, I guess, what you said, thinking again of Nietzsche, he would say, it's not just looking at the individual psychology, the question is what sort of relations, what sort of forces were in place that allowed someone to make a certain claim in the first place. So that's why, again, with you, I don't see a separation between mind and body there. So that's why I was wondering, is there just an exclusive focus on material explanations that excludes this kind of thinking?
Oh, no, I mean, I guess I'm the philosopher in the room or whatever, for what it matters, but the historical materialist account does provide, and in fact that's one of the focal points, an account of the spiritual, intellectual realm, etc. But that account is premised on the recognition that the driving force behind the production of ideas, the belief in spirits, the metaphysical realm, etc., it's the material forces that drive that. And so the idealist approach begins the other way around. And you know, there are many different forms of materialism. And Nietzsche's quite a complicated figure in that regard, because he certainly did not follow people like Marx and Engels and defend the position according to which there are material forces that produce human beings and produce their thoughts according to an economic mode of production, right? There are other forces, and Nietzsche's interested in particular in kind of vital forces, psychological forces, and other such things, but for the historical materialist tradition, those forces are nested within a larger, the social relations of production, the larger social totality, right? And so, in that regard, Nietzsche remains very much a philosopher, meaning beholden to an idealist tradition or elements of an idealist tradition, whereas Marx and Engels were situating that type of philosophical orientation as itself a product of social relations of production, if you will. So I don't know if that helps elucidate a little bit.
At first, it felt like a chicken or the egg situation, which one came first, but it's interesting that they would ground even that in these economic forces.
Yeah.
But then I guess where does it stop? Because then how did those economic...
Well, actually, that's a perfect example. Just really quickly, and then we'll open up for, I know there's a question from the online program. The chicken and egg question is resolved insofar as Marx and Engels were Darwinians. And they said, well, what came first? Your thoughts or material forces? And anyone who's a Darwinian biologist would not say, well, my thoughts. Like, I wasn't fucking there, right? I'm the result of these material forces. And it wasn't, you know, God came first and then produced these material world. It's no, there's an evolution of material forces that got to a point at which there were human beings who had a set of ideas who then created ideas about God or gods that they then used to organize their social relations of production in various ways. That are ideologies, basically. And so that question, I think, is clearly resolved from a materialist point of view, if that makes sense.
Okay, no, that's helpful.
Yeah. Constanza, you want to weigh in?
What about you?
Oh, did you want to say
No,
something? Okay. Go ahead, Constanza.
Okay, so there's two questions about Marxist theory of history and the decolonial characterization of capitalism by Cameron and Samira. I will read them. One of the differences between Afropessimism and theorists like Cedric Robinson versus Marxism is their interpretation of the meaning of modernity / the bourgeois revolutions. Is this debate partly expressing a discomfort with the ethical implications of a theory of history that assumes that capitalism was necessary for liberation to be possible? And if so, what is the proper response to this ethical worry from a Marxist point of view? And the second one is, many major decolonial thinkers, if we can mark the boundaries of the field clearly that is, wrote quite explicitly against cultural essentialism as well as capitalism. How are those, or are those works taken into account in the portrayal of decolonial theory as primarily culturalist or anti-Marxist?
Right there.
Well, you want to read the question. I'll respond to the question about decolonial. I mean, I think plenty of people who argue that they are against essentialism still practice it. I mean, essentialism is like a dirty word in the academy. Nobody's going to say that they're practicing cultural essentialism or anything. But they do. I mean, you look at their writing and you can, and also, their anti-Marxism is explicit. If you look at what I said about Mignolo's saying that liberalism and Marxism are both kind of equally Western ideologies and both therefore, useless for decolonization. That's from a very recent book that he wrote with Catherine Walsh. Maldonado Torres's, critiques of basically saying class analysis is not what we need to understand imperialism. We need to look at epistemology. That's a culturalist argument, and I mean nobody's going to say that that's what they're doing, but in practice, that is.
Well, it's like racism, right? Nobody's going to be like, hey, well, some people are, sorry, but most people will say I'm not racist, and then traffic in racism, right? So it's very much similar. But Derek?
Yes. So, I mean, one thing is that I think the idea that there is, like Marx never said that you have to go through capitalism to get to socialism. He did say that, like, you can't have communism unless you have, like, you're at a certain stage of development, right? Because you have to, like, not have to be working all the time, for example. And in fact, in a very, kind of a famous 1881 letter, he said that the Russian communes, right, could be closer to socialism than, England, the most advanced capitalist. There's a question also, I think, in terms of the Lenin and internationalism. So this is, I would actually reject class first or race first as a way of thinking about things, because in an abstract sense, because, well, it really depends on what are we talking about, When, Barack Obama was president of the United States and he was called, like, racist epithets, to me, I think, we need to think about racism and white supremacy probably first in that instance, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that we don't think about political economy, right? But it just means that, like, what is class as a process? It's an ongoing sort of formation, and so is race, right? So, but there is a very important, why is it that Marxism helped liberate the world from colonialism, right? Well, it really had to do with Lenin's theory of imperialism and the tactical implications, which come from, Marx and Engels, right? So as I talk about Nino in the article, initially Ireland, right, is still a colony of England, literally, still a colonized place fighting for liberation. Marx and Engels were initially like, oh, once we have a socialist revolution in England, then Ireland will be free. But then they saw the chauvinism amongst English workers, and they were like, we need to fight this. And in fact, we need to fight for the self-determination of Ireland, right, as a separate thing. And Lenin took that on and said, because how are you going to make a revolution in Russia? How are you going to get, same thing with us in the United States. How are we going to make a revolution? There's like over 300 million people in the United States, right? very like diverse, multinational, right? How are we going to make a revolution without like getting everybody on our side, getting a lot of people on our side, right? Well, you have to show, like in practice, not just in theory, right, that you're willing to sacrifice and you're willing to struggle for them, which is why the Communist Party, you know, the Comintern in 1928, all the communist parties of the world met together and they adopted the Black Belt thesis, which was put forward at Stalin. Stalin really wanted it advanced, but Harry Haywood was, you know, the theorist, person who really put it together, which said that black people in the United States constitute an oppressed nation, right? Based on, they found census data where black people constituted literally a majority of the population. They had contiguous territory, common culture, ritual, economic practices, et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore, it was the duty of all communists in the United States and in the world to fight for the self-determination of black people under whatever leadership, right? Whether it was capitalist or culturalist or socialist, right? It was, they were duty-bound to do that. And so that's really, I mean, I think, like, that's how you can see, actually, I think that's a much more helpful way to think about it in a sense rather than race. Right? Because, I mean, is it a racial question? I mean, yes, obviously, but it's also a national question, right? It's not about, like, you know, what's your phenotype? Or, like, how do you walk? Or what language do you use? It's about, like, where are you in the social totality? I don't know, Samira, if that was Samira, but whoever asked the question.
Really helpful. We'll open up. I'm just going to add one thing, and why don't I take Stack, and we'll get a few questions. So, I see Esteban and then Juan, and anybody else want to, and you can gesture towards me and I'll add you to the list. I'll just say really quickly in passing that a lot of the debates around is it race first or class first begin with a very fundamental presupposition that is part of liberal ideology, and that is that there's this thing called class that we can separate from this thing called race. And actually the historical materialist position begins by rejecting that presupposition and its starting point. Hence, then liberals who can't understand what it is that historical materialists are doing subject them to their own categories through a process of projection and say, well, oh, okay, well, it must be class first. But you don't have a class analysis that doesn't take into account the historical processes of racialization, because that's how classes are organized, and that's how they've been historically organized, and that's how colonialism functions. And so it's a bad question that leads in a false direction. So why don't we start it with Esteban, then we'll go to Juan and David. We'll take the 3 questions, and then if other people want to get on Stack, I'll just add you. So give me a nod. And just turn on the mics, that'd be great.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for the presentations. And yeah. Well, my question is about the relationship between theory and action. So even the notion of matter is, one could say, a theoretical concept. And if you are Darwinist, for example, as it was clarified, what happens with some group that is being oppressed that simply doesn't see the world as being constituted by matter, or that the concrete interaction with the world isn't about being material or being ideas as opposed to material things. So it may be something that we may call spiritual, for instance, but not in the sense of Geist, in the theory-centric sense of Geist, right? And the other side of the question would be, well, also concerning action, and well, it would be focused on violence. So some groups just don't care about theory and don't think that theory is the fundamental aspect of social processes that would do the change, but rather theory is something that is going after explaining violent struggle, everyday struggle, a concrete struggle.
Great, thanks. Juan?
Actually, my question was similar to your last part when you're talking about violence, because I wanted to when you're talking about Marxism as a tool of liberation, I think about like Marxists for me, or Marxists are like a dysfunctional family. In a way, there's a bunch of different Marxists all the time. There's different problematics for a lot of people. And I'm thinking about like, for example, the case of Colombia, where you can talk about a communist party. They try to lead their own revolution, while after they just came the kind of as they call it at the time, the Chinese Marxism with their own revolution. And there's the case of Cuban, or they call it at the time, we all try to make the revolution. At the end, they fight on each other to make the revolution, and it's related to the concept of violence, because I think the little I know about Marx is how he actually left a lot to understand how the world works in a way, how the economy works, but to change it is something to interpret to different people, and violence is a key concept about it, and I think Lenin talks about it in the books on revolution, when he said like we needed a revolutionary process which is going to be violent, because the bourgeoisie is not going to give the power by itself as a gift, so you have to be violent. So, but after that, it also leading to think like more like an anarchist critic to Marxism in that time, and even today's standards, is what's going to happen after. No? Imagine, hypothetically, we actually achieve the revolution, we go there through the violent processes, and we own the means of production, the means of production. How are we going to guarantee, of course it's a hypothetical question, we're not going to answer, I guess, but how are we going to guarantee that it's not going to become like a new bourgeois state or like neo-fascist or whatever, as anarchists were afraid of at the time. And that's when Lenin said like violence is necessary for having a proletarian dictatorship, of course dictatorship in the way they were taken at the time, but after that, the state is going to fail by itself, more or less, he says, on a revolution, which is, I found it a little bit naive to say. Like, we need violence to do this, but after, we don't need violence, it's going to just fail by itself. And of course, that's why I think violence is a key concept, and we should talk about violence if we're going to talk about activism or anything, because it is important to talk about violence.
Great, thank you, Juan. David?
Thank you so much. This is mostly for Derek, I think. So, as you probably know, Afropessimism, the book itself is kind of and my literature background makes me interested in the style of writing, which is autobiographical, sort of narrative, right? And you noted William Kelly and Cedric Robinson, and my sense of these sort of writers is that, yeah, they talk about Marx, and they talk about how useful Marx is in certain ways, and then they eventually say there's limits to it, and that this is what we're doing to add to certain limits that it's not doing in terms of various things that you've talked about. My sense about these books is that the focus is, or my sense about kind of like this criticisms of Marx is not so much a criticism of Marx as much as it is of the different ways that he was just not capable of covering certain ways of how certain ways that oppressed people feel, right? And so the sort of autobiographical style of Afropessimism has this very sort of particular way of describing a particular way of feeling black. And that seems to be my take on these criticisms, is that they're accounting for different ways of resisting, different ways of thinking about what resistance is, and different ways of creating pleasure that, the role of Marx's brilliance, he was just not capable of, addressing, because it's too much. And so I was wondering if you had thoughts about, like, that aspect of understanding these kinds of criticisms.
Actually, do you want to jump in, as long as we're at it, and then we'll have Derek and Jennifer respond?
Yeah, I think I could I'll keep it short. So my question is about how does Afropessimism relate to, say, black nationalist politics? I think specifically within perhaps the US as well. Because, and I think from both of your presentations, one of the kind of understandings that one gets of Afropessimism is that it's like immobilizing, to sort of quote, and like that it, you don't really have a kind of positive political project that can come out of it. But then when you think about, say, using its own premises to think about a politics of separatism or nationalism, where you sort of withdraw from larger society because that, you know, they're basically incompatible, right? Because it's anti-black. But, and following, so that's kind of what my question is, and following from that is, if there is a relation between the two, how would you sort of categorize the relationship to like modern capitalism, right? So, because generally, you can, within black nationalist movements, you can have groups that are, you know, which have more socialist underpinnings, and other movements that are more, I guess, agnostic to capitalist exploitation. But I'm not sure specifically how Afropessimism thinks about that as well. Because because its first premise is that, you know, slavery in itself was this distinguishing sort of form of exploitation that marks black people differently. But thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to comment briefly on some of the questions around Afropessimism. To your question, David, I really wanted to recommend an article by Nick Mitchell on Afropessimism that writes specifically about the kind of style, the kind of auto theory style, and argues that this is kind of a mode of self-defense, of protecting, of kind of holding its claims beyond criticism because of the way. So I think it would be of interest to your question. Around the question of nationalism and separatism in Afropessimism, there was an article that recently came out by Jose Sanchez, I think, that argues, you know, that sees it as kind of akin to or related to nationalist and separatist type of politics, and then goes into kind of a lengthy critique of those. And what I think is really important about that critique, as well as like how we might think of like the historical development of these different forms of thought in the U.S., particularly since the 60s, is the kind of class analysis that's provided by, in this article I mentioned by Jose Sanchez, but also by other thinkers like Adolph of these types of discourses. And like Jose Sanchez argues that basically, I think that he says something like Afropessimism is the old wine of black nationalism in the new bottles of a alienated middle-class intelligentsia. And argues, like Reid and others have, that this type of kind of defeatist, and in many ways kind of anti-strategic thinking, because it's very against kind of actually having a strategy for change. Sanchez and Reid also argue that this is very distinctly a kind of ideology of the professional managerial class. And I think this, and that it's kind of, as you know, Derek was talking about, like why would people embrace an ideology that's so defeatist? And means we don't really have to do anything, but we just can, write essays witnessing the trauma that are just bearing witness to this historical trauma that we can't change. And I think there's it's a really important argument to analyze like why that is a class-specific kind of ideology and why is it embraced by a particular kind of PMC, which is related to the larger argument that I think Reid has developed most comprehensively in terms of thinking about U.S. political culture. That there's his argument that the kind of natural home of identity politics is the professional managerial class, and this is part of a kind of a larger larger argument, a historical argument that he makes as well as others have made, like Cedric Johnson and Touré Reid, of tracing why certain forms of nationalist ideologies, but that develop, or particularly kind of identitarian forms of thinking, are embraced by a kind of ascendant fraction, a sort of upwardly mobile sector of groups that had been struggling for, involved in liberation struggles. Because, and argues that, they argue that this is these kind of identitarian ideologies that flatten or, totally obscure class differences are most useful for members of the PMC who are proximate to power and who can benefit from positioning themselves as spokespersons of racial groups. And the term they use is kind of, I think, race brokers. as being a kind of brokers between the working class and elites by casting themselves as, you know, kind of racial spokespeople. And Reid has really developed this, you know, critique really comprehensively. But part of, I think, another important aspect of that historicization that he and Cedric Johnson provide is also of understanding, you know, how kind of nationalist claims, including those that came out of, you know, struggles for liberation, right? I'm thinking of national liberation struggles of the 60s in the US, for example. They argue that there's, notwithstanding, not discounting the kind of, the fact that these were part of, of actual, liberation struggles with genuine goals towards liberation, but that this type of ideology also dovetailed with the hegemonic ideology of racial liberal pluralism in the US, where which kind of equates political constituency with a racial group, right? And that this is how this form of liberalism becomes dominant in the U.S. and therefore, they're analyzing how there's a kind of conjoining of certain types of thinking. Well, I should go back, because they also argue that this type of thinking of the kind of racial pluralism that is hegemonic in U.S. political culture also influenced the development of nationalist consciousness in liberation struggles. And this is an important kind of differentiation that they make between the co-option thesis, that some argue that, nationalism was the nationalism of liberation struggles in the US was more akin, for example, to anti-colonial liberation struggles. But they also argue, yeah, but it also developed within a context of racial liberal pluralism that offers kind of possibilities of uplift for, a very small sector of these groups if they serve a kind of managerial function vis-a-vis racialized working classes.
Which is a bit like the comprador bourgeoisie, right? It's just an internal comprador bourgeoisie, so that you have the elites who are the blacks who speak for all blacks, the Latinos who speak for all Latinos, and then there are members of the professional managerial class who then manage the general population of their particular group that they speak in the name of, right? Yeah. I just wanted to add that on quickly. Derek?
Yep. Yes, well, first, thank you for all the questions and for listening and everything. I appreciate it. The questions are good. Esteban, talk about theory and action. Have you ever read the introduction to the Grundrisse? You should. You should, because this is precisely what he's concerned about, right? Because he says, okay, because this is his difference with Hegel, right? He's like, okay, we have reality. I have this thing right here, right? I have a chaotic conception of it. I need to break it down. What's it made of, right? How is it stitched together? Blah, 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 right? What are these determinations? And then I recompose it, and I go back and now I understand it differently, right? As a site of many rich different determinations, but I haven't changed the thing itself, right? So Hegel would say it's this is becoming more like my ideal or whatever, right? By changing my ideas, I'm changing this. But for Marx, it's actually, you're kind of doing both at the same time. It's not as if, material conditions unidirectionally determine our ideas, right? Or else why the hell would Marx write his ideas down, Because we want to use them to change the world, So we're kind of, I think, doing both, right? Where it's you have what's called the real concrete and the thought concrete, right? Real concrete is this thing, reality, and the thought concrete is my thinking about it in the head, They stay parallel, my head never becomes the thing itself, right? But based on our social intercourse and our decisions, we can change the thing then based on our theory, right? Which is why, Marx says that, the weapon of criticism will never replace weapons, but theory, if it's gripped by the masses, can become a material force, if it informs our action, because that's how we make sense of things, right? And I think we have to care about theory. I understand why a lot of people don't, because, if you pick up one of these academic journals, why would you care about that? But we need more Marxists. But, here's the thing, is that, the problem is that we think that theory is associated with the university, but it's not. Theory is basically just our reflections. Marxist theory is the class struggle reflecting on the class struggle. That's what Marxist theory is, And so, yeah, we absolutely need more of that. But how do you test Marxist theory? You test it in practice. You know, does it work or not? Like, that's the only way. You can't, like, which is why I hate a lot of the academic debates relative to, like, radical politics. It's like, you can't prove a theory in an article. You prove it, like, you fight with it. You know what I mean? And you see what it gets you. Like, what strategic benefits does it have? You know, that's how you prove it. And so I think that, yeah, like, you know, without, you know, it's like the religious people, they say something like, without works, faith is dead or something, or without whatever. Do people know that? Anyways, you can't just believe in God, you have to act on it too. So I will defend Lenin. Poor Lenin. No, I'm just kidding. But I think that what he's saying is like, eventually we'll learn to do things without a state. He's saying that we have no fucking idea what it's going to look like. You know, that's kind of, in State and Revolution, that's what he's talking about. He's like, between this first stage, which we call socialism, and the second stage, which we call communism, there's like a million little nuances and different ways and phases, and like, I can't do that here. But we gotta smash the state, you know, and build a new one. Which is basically how, speaking to Juan, your question, right? Like the education, the dysfunctional family and what happens afterwards. I think, like, well, let's get there first, and then we'll see. It's up to us, you know. It's up to us. Like, we're the people who do it, you know. But there's this kind of blackmail where it's like, oh no, you're going to end up as like the new authoritarianism, right? And that's why we have to have theory, because or else people think it's like authority is the problem, and not like capitalism, you know. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. And then David, I mean, I think I like, well, you know, Robin Kelly in particular, you know, is very great. Like, I really like his writing, Freedom Dreams, and talking about, you know, his mother. It's like, you know, all those recounting. I think it's really great. What Jennifer said made me think of something I always tell my students. They always talk about how I feel. Well, I feel this or that. And, you know, you can't tell somebody how they feel, right? Which is why people always say, well, I just feel like this, or it's just my opinion, you know? It's like, well, you can't, you know, critique me for how I feel, right? It's like, that's why we need to stay it. But I think, yes, Marx didn't think of everything, and he didn't want to, and he didn't claim to, you know? Like, so it makes no sense. So I think when people phrase it like that, like basically a lot of quote-unquote critiques of Marxism, if they're in good faith, all they're really doing is adding more determinations or abstractions to Marxist thought. You know what I mean? They're making it richer, right? You know, but why I think like Cedric Robinson's like, it's bad faith is because in the very introduction, he's like, it's just Western and, you know, blah, 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 right? And it's kind of like, well, you know, that's not, like, you can't really build from that, right? But I think a lot of critiques of Marxism, that's why I'm like a united front theoretically, you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, we'll take whatever you have, you know what I mean? Like, and we'll help it work. So, yeah, I don't know. And, I mean, yeah, they're accounting for different ways of thinking about resistance. I just don't know if that's resistance or not. You know what I mean? Like, because if, like, you know, I'm not trying to say that, like, politics is like, you know, fighting with weapons or something like that, obviously. But when we, you know, especially in the university, we think, like, everything is resistance, you know? Somebody, I think there was a comment up there, like, in the Zoom about this, too, you know? I think this is true, like, everything is resistance, you know? Like, oh, I'm fighting, you know? And if you're, like, a grad student, you should do that in your journal articles, because it'll help you get published. You know what I mean? Like, you'll say, like, this, you know, you have, like, a throwaway line about how this is important or whatever, and, you know, so do it for, you know, because we need to eat. But, like, you know, it doesn't really fucking matter. You know what I mean? Like, basically. Like, it's not like, you know, it's why I think about I'm all for open access journals, and I hate, you know, publish, but it's not as if, like, the movement's sitting around waiting for, like, some paywalled article to make our next advance. You know what I mean? Like, no, right? Which is why, like, theory is important, but, like, we've already got it. We're doing it, you know? The people are always doing it. And then finally, Afro-pessimism and black nationalism, yeah, I mean, there's always different strands of black nationalism, right? Is it sort of like ghetto nationalism is what it used to be called, like the small shop owners, right? Revolutionary nationalism. And then within, think about the American Indian movement, which is an indigenous organization in the United States. People may have heard of Leonard Peltier as a political prisoner in the United States, been a political prisoner, like one of the longest serving ever. But he was in the American Indian movement, and he was like the head of the socialist wing. And after there was a shootout, you know, basically people who were part of the culturalist wing are the ones who told the FBI where he was, right, to defeat that. So there's all these kind of struggles in there, but the thing is like, I think Afro-pessimism, because it doesn't, I mean, you could, like, maybe I would be interested if somebody, well, I don't know if I would actually be interested, but it would be interesting, probably for someone, if if somebody were to think more about this in terms of like the parallels to it. But for me, it seems like it's not like, I mean, I would take like the Nation of Islam, black nationalism any day over this nonsense, you know, because at least like people do shit, you know what I mean? Like they're like doing things. I think reading the history of this is so important because obviously like I'm not going to go into, you know, a meeting of a black nationalist organization and be like, here's what you should do, right? Because that's why we need to be organized and have divisions of labor in ways that are conscious about how we're being received in the struggle, right? So different comrades, different academics, people in different positions, right? Like if we're fighting the university for something, we're going to think like, well, how are you going to be received as a student? Well, you know, students have a lot of rights in a sense, right? More than their like, you know, grad student faculty or whatever, right? More than the janitors, you know? So we have to think about like our division of labor and who's engaging in what kinds of struggles where. But I think that for me, Afropessimism, like the battle against it is kind of part of this, which is why I co-authored that piece with the black comrade, you know, like I couldn't put that out there on my own. I mean, and it's not my own, you know what I mean, but it's like a collaborative process, but I'm thinking through with somebody, you know, because I have to. But also we're trying to model that unity. It's hard, you know, it's hard. It's hard to do that because it's contradictory, but.
Great, I know we're almost at the end of our time. Constanza, you want to bring in a question or two, and we'll try to keep things as tight as possible.
Sure. So there's one question on descriptive differences and aesthetics for Jennifer. As you mentioned, descriptive differences impose or enforce a hierarchy. How do descriptive differences relate to aesthetics and further our formal analysis and categorization of art? And there's another question by Sabrina on the concept of ideology. Portella writes about anti-colonial liberation movements engaged in armed conflict with colonial military forces, and this pain of being inspired by anti-colonial liberation movements. Do contemporary liberation movements require such armed conflict to be effective? What's the relationship between violence and ideology here, education and praxis?
Great, thank you so much. I'm actually going to jump in again because I know, just in the interest of time, if people have to leave at 7, it's absolutely fine. Just keep it quiet as you're exiting. But I did see there's a few more questions, so we'll try to keep the conversation as tight as possible. Quickly formulated questions. There's at least 2 here. If anybody else wants to jump on, then we will. We'll do a dog pile of questions. Have a final response from Derek and Jennifer, and then we'll wrap up. So Ugo, and then yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, we were talking about race and this problem and relationship with Marxism. I couldn't avoid but thinking about in another field that I'm interested in, it's queer theory, and that has a lot of problems with culturalism and idealism. But as a Marxist, I find a problem because when it comes to race and when it comes to liberation struggles, we can say Marxism was there.
Was what?
Was there.
Right.
We have a story, we can say it was there. We cannot do that with gender struggles. We can certainly not do that, especially with the queer people, with the trans people. We cannot do that. So as a Marxist, what I'm wondering is, what are we doing with the problem of recognizing the pretty historical and material failure of Marxism as a theory, as a group, to acknowledge the relevance of those struggles in the struggle against capitalism? I don't know if I'm being clear. I think that as being part of Marxism, we tend to be very defensive and trying to explain how Marxism was already there. Mm-hmm. But that's a very particular case that put us at a state. That is, there was a blind spot for Marxism. And Marxism took a long time to realizing that was a problem. So what I mean is not very much, but how can we understand that process and what does that teach us about Marxism and how can it evolve and progress, basically.
Great.
So I...
Turn the mic on. You just press the button.
Hi, so I wanted to ask Jennifer what she meant by the historical materialist understanding of race and its ideal of the abolition of race. Like, what does the abolition of race look like? Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that the culturalist understanding emphasizes the need to change the Western episteme. So if that isn't an important goal, how does the abolition of race doesn't fall back into this notion of a universal subject that I would believe is quite problematically present in the Western episteme, right? So the idea is that, my idea is that in the shift from modernity to contemporary life, there is also a shift from this notion of a universal humanist subject to subjectivation, and it's more fragmented experiences like in queer theory, feminist thought, race studies. So how do we account for this more fragmentary nature of contemporary life without, I don't know, reducing it to a culturalist or idealist understanding of this? And secondly, this is like a minor question, but so Ranciere's break with Althusser was in part this admission that the students can also be revolutionary subjects, or academics can also be revolutionary subjects. So if we undermine the work of the academic work of like giving voice to, I don't know, lived experience and erased subject, how does that not fall back into a hierarchy of only the worker is allowed to be at the forefront of liberation?
Sorry, did you just, I just missed the last part of what you said.
So I'm wondering what you make of Ranciere's break with Althusser about like the student being capable of being a revolutionary subject or not, because
going a final time. Any final words, questions? There's people down at the end too. Yeah?
Well, I don't have a mic, but I'll try this. Just very quickly, and this is a question that I don't expect a final answer for, but Derek, I would be really, really interested in hearing more about, like, what do you think it's possible for us? I think that a lot of us we're going to be in that spot where we have to work for a university, we have to publish in the very boring journals, and I really want to think that that it's possible to be, along similar lines as a final question, like the last question. Is it possible then to be an academic today, for instance, in the US, and a revolutionary at the same time? I know that you can be that in parallel, but I'm wondering, like, and you know, like with things, specifically with things like Afropessimism, reading that type of thing with my students, or like having my students being exposed to that type of concepts and fads, like, it's so seductive, and it's so, for them, it's so easy to digest, right? Because in a way, it's like of one piece with, you know, what they know about fiction now. Like auto fiction is right, the only fiction that they know, and so like how to resist that? Like, is it worth it to try to deprogram those students and turn them into materialists in an Ivy League school, or like a you know, privileged college, or should I just keep my strength for a different type of student? So yeah, that's it.
Great, thanks so much. I know that there are a few lingering questions in the online program as well. I think you know, it's the first session that we have some content, so we're going to have a lot of kind of ongoing conversations. Maybe just in the interest of time, I'll ask Derek and Jen to give their final comments in response to whatever questions they want to pick up on.
Yeah. And people can email me later.
For sure. Plenty of follow-up. And again, if people need to leave, we will judge you, but we'll be very excited about it. You can leave if you have other obligations.
The Althusserians are staying.
Okay. Okay, these are great questions, so thank you. Okay, the question about how does a scriptive difference inform the categorization and hierarchization of art. I think it often does in the reception of art and the, you know, in all the ways that the kind of art markets are racially stratified and, I mean, ultimately stratified by class, which is racialized. So, you know, the questions, you can't ever take the question of like class out of understanding who gets to be an artist, who even has that possibility of being recognized as an artist, whose artistic labor gets understood as artistic, etc. And given the racialization of class, those are always racial, and oftentimes kind of questions that, well, always racialized questions, but oftentimes implicate kind of colonial and neo-colonial relationships. And I mean, for example, like the very, you know, categories we have of bourgeois art that recognize like what is considered fine art are, you know, are historically emerged from the kind of vaunting of bourgeois nationalist cultures and don't tend to recognize the aesthetic production of colonized people or, you know, as having the kind of aesthetic value, for example, that's attributed to fine arts. That's one common example. Something I've seen often, because I've worked in contemporary art and I've worked in it also as like a curator and a researcher, etc., is the way that ascriptive ideologies like around gender and race really inform the way that people interpret art by racialized people or by women, or etc. So there's actually a contemporary artist, Jason Mussman, who has a persona called Hennessy Youngman, who does a wonderful skit about this, where he says, you know, okay, if I'm just I paint a picture of a flower, okay, it's a flower. I'm a woman artist, well now it's a vagina. You know, I'm a black artist, now it's going to be the flower of Amistad or something. And you probably, I mean, I see this all the time. Oftentimes if an artist who's a racialized minority produces work, their work will be interpreted as being about their racial identity, not about something that could have a larger, more universal significance, right? So I think that's one example. But it's not just a matter of interpretation. It's also very often a matter of whose work is vaunted, whose work gets written about, who gets the commission, etc. And I think at that level we always have to kind of also look at the questions of like the material relations that these kind of ideological judgments then, you know, imply. In terms of the question around you know, I don't agree that Marxists were not there talking about gender and sexuality when I think about angles on the origin of the family, or the argument that, you know, the relationship between man and woman is the kind of first instance, is the kind of model of the relationship of the bourgeois to the proletariat, or thinking about, you know, the centrality of the woman question and the, you know, to the Bolsheviks, or thinking about all of the, you know, really important you know, subsequent Marxist thinking around gender, you know, as well as, you know, in terms of sexuality, I think the question, well, in terms of sexuality as well, like the difference between kind of liberal queer theory and Marxist, you know, accounts of sexuality, whether they're from Daniel Garan and Mario Miele, or the Gay Liberation Fund, or the Third World Gay Liberation Front, or people like Rosemary Hennessy, or people like Marta Jimenez. I just think there's a lot of thinking around this. At the same time, of course, you know, movements have emerged at different moments that then are, so like the gay liberation movement, you know, emerges in the 60s and 70s, not in the 19th century. Of course, that affects the kind of theorizing that happens around it, in the same way that the kind of ecological crisis that we're, you know, that has, you know, that we're aware of in a way, has produced kind of thinking, Marxist thinking around ecology that's different from what happened in the 19th century. So part of the question then, I guess, of thinking of why there are blind spots at certain moments, I think just also has to do with it being a living theory, right? Not something that can see into the future, but that responds the kind of, like what you said, the kind of class struggle, reflecting on the class struggle, and therefore new questions and new analyses have to emerge. Also, not only as historical conditions change, but also as our possibilities of knowledge about the world change, right? In terms of the question of what I was saying about how the historical materialist understanding of race relates to the possibility of the abolition of race, what I was trying to point out is that you know, like this argument where I was quoting Barbara Fields, that if we understand that race is a historical product, that race as an ideology is the product or the precipitate of racist practices, these emerge at historical moments for discernible reasons, right? Understanding that also allows us the possibility of thinking of why race might be abolished as an ideology, as distinct from thinking that it has a kind of trans-historical existence as an ideology, right? But also, you know, this argument that if we understand it as an ideology that has the force that it has in the world, because it is useful for ruling classes for reproducing certain class relations. Like the question that, you know, we always have to have the question of, okay, there's all these ideas, but why do some of them have the force in the world that they have? Why can they organize the world in the way that they do? Why? And that question then, you know, leads us to ask, well, we can't think of these just as free-floating ideas that don't have a history, but how are they actually grounded in material practices, right? So then the question would be, if we understand that, you know, in the modern world, race has a very particular function in reproducing social hierarchies that are necessary for the reproduction of capitalism, then we would understand that a struggle against those relations that give those ideologies power would be necessary for working towards the abolition of race. And I would distinguish that from what you were talking about, okay, if decolonial theorists are talking about changing the Western episteme. My problem with that argument is the way that it's treating ideology as this free-floating thing. Because the question is, okay, we want to change, how do we think? How do we do that? Like, okay, where do ideas come from? How are ideas given institutional power, right? Again, you know, we're all in institutions that produce knowledge. Well, you know, so you can see very clearly that they're organized in ways and subject to power in ways that give certain ideas power in the world and proliferate certain ideas and bury others. So if we want to change how we think, we can't, that's not just like we just choose to. Like we have to actually ask, okay, well why, how are ideas produced and what gives certain ideas certain power? So that's my question of saying, okay, yes, we want to change these epistemes, but you can't do that without looking at the material relations in which knowledge is grounded, right? That's I think and in terms of the question around Rancière, I'm not a Rancière expert, so I think that would be something more you could speak to.
Well, Derek?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that that there's obviously a history of, you know, the communist, you know, pole of the women's struggle and the gay liberation struggle or whatever, and there's obviously like you know, the Cuban state, you know, recently apologized, right, you know, publicly, and they passed a new family law, which is really fantastic and gives even more power to children and help emancipate children and domestic responsibilities and so on and so forth, you know. So I mean, what I think is basically, I would say that like Marxism is like a humble theory also, you know, that it learns, like you know, it always has to do that. And also, that here's the thing, is that like, you know, the Soviet Union was around from 1917 to 1991. That's like less than you know, like some of us will live, you know. So I also think that we should like think about our expectations, you know, and like not expect, you know, it to do everything, right? Which isn't an excuse, but it's a sort of accounting for it, or an explanation, not an exoneration per se, right? Yeah, no, so I think that, you know, where we are, like in the U.S., you know, like it's just basically like that's all you get, you know, and so our instinct, I think we should not be defensive, you know, we should be proud, you know, about like the amazing accomplishments our class has made, you know, and we should also acknowledge the terrible tragedies and mistakes, because there's been a lot, you know, but there's also been like, you know, I mean, we're carrying like we're like inheritors of a very inspiring, you know, and transformative like legacy that we're carrying on, you know, and I think that's where like we should be humble, but we should also be like, yeah, we've done this, like it's incredible, you know, like the things that our class is capable of is really incredible. So yeah, I mean, I think it's about, you said, how do we understand that process and what does that teach us? And I think that, for me, that's the answer, you know, like that reflection. How do we understand that? What does this teach us? That's what we have to be asking ourselves. And I will say, you know, much in the same way that Jennifer talked about like an art, like a woman artist, or art then is all about, you know, her identity. You know, I will say, like, as a white guy teaching, the shit I can teach that my colleagues can't because I don't have like an interest in it, even though they know I'm a communist, you know, it's unbelievable. Like, so there's, you know, like that's really interesting thing I just thought about that as you were speaking, where it's like never about, even though I am like an old, you know, it's not like a secret or anything. But this is a very good question. You know, being a professor it basically means that I sell. It's a form of labor power that I sell in exchange for a wage to survive. You know, it's a particular form of concrete labor. And so, you know, we are workers, right? We're members of the working class. Some of us are, you know, paid very well. Some of us are paid very poorly in all sorts of varieties. But, you know, it's a job. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that it's important for academics and for other people to realize that, like, you know, this is like, I mean, for me, I like it. It's like a better way for me to sell my labor power. It's a better kind of labor power for me to sell to survive than other kinds, so I like that. But like, you know, like just like if I'm working, you know, when I worked at the plastic factory as a kid, like I had to press the button and get the thing out and do, you know, like all the things. Well, I got to go through the motions. You got to do that too, you know. The real question is like, well, are there opportunities for me to talk to my coworker who's working the machine next to me, you know? Or am I going to be able to agitate with them? So it's kind of, I think about it in parallel with that, right? And so I think to the extent that you can in any single job, we should be agitating. And, you know, the thing about being in the university is always that we work with ideas and knowledge and we have a captive audience, right? And so I think it's about making it attractive and making it like, you know, trying to like get people interested in it, right? But I think, you know, to the extent that like professors have participated in revolutionary struggles, it's generally been as revolutionaries and not as professors, you know. But that doesn't mean that, you know, Walter Rodney is an example of somebody who was specifically intentionally thinking, I got a university job, how can I give back to my people, how can I divert? And this is where I think Fred Moten stuff, you know, about like undercommons and all that kind of stuff is actually useful, you know, like let's take, like, you got access to money, you know, like give me some grants and, you know. But I don't view teaching as like politics, you know, like when I'm in the classroom, I'm not organized, I'm not recruiting, you know, like those are different things. And I think it's important at least, I mean, I'm an educational theorist, you know, so I think about these things a lot, so I have a very long answer I can give you, but, you know, that's kind of what I'm thinking about it too, is that like, I'm trying to like give my students frameworks through which to make sense of the world and themselves and us and each other, and like that's what I want to do, you know, and then they'll take the ones that, you know, like explain the most. It's kind of like, you know, a marketplace of ideas. Just kidding, it's not, because I still make the syllabus, but like, yeah, I mean, you know, if you just gotta teach, you gotta get that paycheck, but to the extent that you can, you know, like, I think it's great. Like, I think that as, you know, as the movement grows, then the movement's position in the university should become more prominent also. You know, it's going to be reflective of that. I mean, we've been in the United States and Western academia since, I mean, how long has it been? It's been decades since we've had like a real revolutionary agenda. You know, and I think that's starting to change. And that, you know, it used to be like that until they fired everybody, you know, and blacklisted them, right? And then the deal was, you can teach, you know, at the university and be a Marxist, but you have to denounce every single socialist revolution that's ever happened, you know? So you could like it on paper, but not in practice. So I think, you know, like, yeah, we should try to do that, you know, and I don't care, like, you know, wherever you're publishing, yeah, try to get that in there, you know, try to make more, try to get students, you know, but also, like, I also think that it's like, you know, it's a nice activity because, like, what are we producing? Humans, in a sense, right? So I think we should also take that seriously. Yeah, I don't know, thank you.
But yeah, just like a very quick addition to that, like, there's also like the counterpart to that, right? Like, I also want to become a better educator for organizing, right? So that's where I think that I see sort of like that conjunction, and maybe, you know, an added advantage of having a job at a university, like you get a practice, although it's not exactly the same tactics or like exactly the same voice that you use in one format.
Same printer though. You can print as much stuff as you want.
Well, on that note, yeah, on that note, I know today was a little bit more intense than yesterday drinking in the park, but really appreciate the great questions, the engagement. We'll give a big round of applause to Derek and Jennifer for thanks, Constanza, for helping out with coordinating everything, or with Ross for you as well. I know there are plenty of lingering questions and other themes and topics, but we're going to be together for 3 weeks, so we're going to be able to revisit them and hash them out. Tomorrow, same place, same time, Jack House will be here, who's a historian, so we're going to be shifting gears and should be an interesting conversation. So enjoy the evening, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Gabriel.